So this would have been for, I'm guessing, my daughter's first birthday. There she is. Her name is May. We named her after my father. And me and my wife, Hannah. So this would be in our house in Toronto. So this would be, we'll see this house again when we go back. This is in front of my grandparents' house in their yard in Pudica. So that's me with my mother and probably about a year here. This was actually, interestingly, there's a festival called the Ashkenaz Festival in Toronto, which is a cultural festival. And this was not long after my book came out. I did a reading there. I'm with my parents, my father, my mother. This is my girlfriend who became my wife, Hannah. And this is Jurmala, and it says 1976, so I'd be 3 here. Again, my parents. It was a popular thing to do was to take the picture on this sailboat in Jurmala. I think anybody who grew up in Riga and went to Jurmala has a picture like this. Well, I was 6 at the time when we left. I don't know to what extent my parents, were open about it. I'm sure they were as, circumspect about it as they could have been. But I do remember really the day that we left. And I remember 2 things. One is in our bathroom, we had gum wrappers from foreign chewing gum that had been glued on, to the walls as decoration. This is a crazy thing that, who does this? But at the time, this was like a matter of prestige or something, it's like from abroad. I remember taking those down. That was very painful. And I remember really leaving the apartment and, and crying in the stairwell and kissing the walls. I was a very dramatic child, kissing the walls of this apartment, which you should see because we returned to look at it. Nobody would kiss the walls of that apartment today. But that experience I remember. So at first we thought we were going to Australia. Australia, he had a great aunt there, but somehow that fell out. Then for a moment we were going to go to Atlanta because my parents had friends who'd gone to Atlanta. And we'd gone to HIAS to declare that we're going to Atlanta. And at HIAS, my father saw a friend of his from Riga who was working at HIAS. And this is actually, in the book, most of what happens really didn't happen to my family, but this episode is actually very close to what happened. So my father's friend who was working as a social worker at HIAS, he came up and he said, "Manuel Naumovich, nice to see you. Where are you going?" And he said, "We're going to Atlanta." And he says, "You're crazy. People who we send to Atlanta don't want to go. You're volunteering. It's 40 degrees in the shade. What are you going to do?" I said, "Better option, Canada. Canada just opened. You're a young family. You're a professional family. It's a good time. Why don't you think about it? Why don't you go to Canada?" And literally, it was a decision that was made in a stairwell. And from there, that's it. They decided, my father and my uncle and all of them, that they're going to completely change course and go to Toronto. And that was it. The first book was a collection of stories about the same family, told from the perspective of a, Russian Jewish boy. And I knew those were going to be stories. I wanted to tell the story of this Russian, we'll call it Russian, Soviet Jewish experience in North America, which I'd never seen done at the time. So, the first book was written from the perspective of a young boy, and you could say it's closer to my experience, even though it's still fiction. But the novel is really told from the perspective of people who are a generation older than me or 2 generations older than me. But frankly, that's the interesting part. The children were they were luggage. You brought them along and they came along, but they didn't make any of the decisions. But I was fascinated by this choice that people made, my parents and their friends. How do you leave not only just a country, but you leave a language, and you leave a complete cultural and ideological way of life that is so different than what's coming. I think leaving, on one hand, was easy because everybody saw that the Soviet Union was a corrupt system, and I don't think anybody really had much love for the system. But you had friends, you had family, you had things, everything you understood, you had a career. And how to do that, to me, that, I admire it a great deal, I'm fascinated by it, and I wanted to see if I could kind of inhabit those people. Because I was so young, I really didn't remember very much, and I wanted to go back with my parents. My father, born in, not Riga, in Daugavpils, And then he was born in 1935, so they evacuated during the war. But he really grew up in Riga. It was his city. So he would take us through places. In fact, I'm not sure if this is anything specific, but I wanted to see, the building where he grew up, his school, the university. So that's at the bottom here. It's the two of us. Looks like old Riga. I was more nostalgic than they were. If not for me, I don't think they would have gone back the same way. I really wanted to go. If you remember, there was some pictures of me with my mother in front of this little house in black and white on a bench. I think that's the same bench. So this is where my grandparents lived. I don't know if it felt the same for us. I think it was more nostalgic for my parents, or more emotional, and I think more for my mother. My father didn't really show very much that way. For me, it felt foreign, not familiar. I'd never been in a place that was so homogenous, or if not homogenous, I come from Toronto, or I've lived in North America. When I got to Latvia, I really felt like I was conspicuous, that anybody who looked at me knew I was a Jew. Because I could see, if I know that that one's a Russian and that one's a Latvian, they know that I'm like, I'm not Italian. It was so strange and peculiar that everybody had left. We had nothing. We had a family there. We had friends. We had nobody, we had a few people to call, but really nobody. And that this Jewish community that had existed even during the Soviet period was gone. And there had been no war. It was so strange. What made all these people, an entire, race, ethnicity of people, just up and leave, gone? It was a close, warm family. It was a Jewish family. I think when I compare it to some other people I know, Soviet Jews, I think we were more traditional or more aware, and that had a lot to do with my grandfather, who grew up in Latvia and was educated in the interwar period. He was actually a big Zionist and wanted to make Aliyah. We observed the holidays even in Riga. So my grandfather, we would do Pesach, we would do Rosh Hashanah, we would do, Hanukkah, in some version of it. At my grandparents' house, they would close the curtains so nobody would see. I was told it was my grandfather's birthday, and it was my grandfather's birthday again, and it was my grandfather's birthday another time, right? So I didn't go to kindergarten and say something stupid. And I think that is consistent, with a lot of Baltic Jews, because it was this experience that they weren't Sovietized until after the war. So there was this generation of people who were still, had gone to Jewish schools, had Yiddish, had Hebrew, and the culture hadn't been Sovietized. I was a reader. I don't, we're not a literary family really, but my mother read. My father didn't read all that much. But readers are, I think it's a genetic thing. So I was a reader, and I always wanted to write. I don't know how to explain that other than that's just what it was. It's usually an anecdote or something that I see, which has some kind of dramatic potential. I'll give you an example. When we went back to Latvia on that trip, we visited a lot of cemeteries because everybody we knew was dead. So we went to see them, right? And it's this common cemetery tour of the homeland, which is weird and sad. I remember overhearing in the hotel where we were staying, there were some people who were from the West Coast who would also come on their cemetery tour, talking about how they were going to either replace or refurbish somebody's gravestone. And to me, I started thinking about that, and that seemed like that is the symbol for these people and who we are now. That the past, these people come from abroad, they've made lives. All they can do now is bring some money and, kind of pretty up the graveyards. And usually it's something like that. I'll hear some anecdote which has some emotional resonance for me. How important is luck? I think luck is important, but I think you make your own luck. I'm not the first person to say that. There are many great artists who were discovered far too late after they died. So that happens, there's no question. Luck is part of it. I think, the biggest part is perseverance, because what looks like luck, there are probably, years of perseverance that precede the luck. So I think from what I've seen of, people who achieve any kind of success in the arts, it's you hope talent, but talent without perseverance rarely gets you anywhere.